I've played a lot of indie games. Some might argue too many, and they'd be right. But today I want to talk about the best ones I've played, and by the end select one that I think stands above all the others. But first, a few disclaimers. I know this is gonna sound crazy, but I haven't played every single indie game. I know, wild, right? So here's what I need you to do. If there's a game that you think should have been mentioned in this video, let me know about it in the comments. I'm always looking for more great indies to play and potentially make videos on. This isn't necessarily going to be about my favorite indie game. Naturally, this is just my opinion, but I want this to be about the most impactful game. If this was about my favorite indie game, I'd just say crosscode, surprise no one, and end the video. So with that out of the way, let's get started. You know how sometimes you play a game that just completely blindsides you? That feeling when you start up a game that you're mildly interested in and it totally consumes your life for a week? Well, that's what happened when I played Chained Echoes. I mean, don't get me wrong, at a glance I knew I'd enjoy this game. It's an indie JRPG that was inspired by some of my favorite games of all time, so of course I was willing to give it a shot. But I actually put off playing it multiple times since I didn't really consider it much of a priority. However, almost immediately after I launched the game for the first time, I realized how much of a mistake I had made. Within the first 10 hours of gameplay, all of which took place on one of the least productive days I've had in a while, I had to ask myself a crazy question that I didn't think I'd have to. Is this the best indie game I've ever played? In fact, it had such a great start that I consistently expected some sort of drop in quality, but that just never happened. Contrarily, it actually got better as it went. As the hours passed like seconds, I felt as though I was transported not just to another world, but another time as well. And yet, despite the fact that it takes so much inspiration from these games, it inherits none of their flaws. Take the combat, for example. Chained Echoes takes the traditional turn-based style and adds swapping and the overdrive system. The first one is pretty self-explanatory. You can swap characters in and out mid-battle to whoever best fits the situation, but it's the overdrive bar that really reinvents turn-based combat. I'm gonna go through this pretty quick, but if you want a more in-depth look, you can check out this video dedicated to the game. So for a quick surface-level overview, here's how the combat works. Basically, there are 3 parts of this bar. Each one gives various benefits and detriments. Each action you take will raise your position in the bar, and your actions up here lower it. You always want to stay in green because of the buffs you receive, but sometimes you'll want to push yourself to red just to heal, or maybe you have a huge attack lined up and you just want to go all out despite the fact that you'll put yourself into red. The overdrive system adds far more to consider than a normal turn-based battle would, and it really breathes new life into this style of combat. Naturally, the characters and story follow the same pattern. The writing is clever and there are brilliant twists and turns throughout the story. At one point, the party gets split up after encountering some soldiers. You can overhear a conversation between 2 of these soldiers later where they mention that they don't remember what any of the party members looked like. The character is naturally relieved until they mention that they do remember one character. The one who's been stated to be very attractive and is dressed in an outfit with the same color as a subscribe button that you haven't pressed yet, with equally red hair, who just so happens to be the one listening to this conversation. And yeah, of course, if there's anyone in the group that you'll remember at a glance, it's her. It's just obvious, but it's little details like this that make the game feel so alive. In nearly every way, Chained Echoes perfectly captures the spirit of what an indie game can be. In its ability to recapture the past while adding its own personal flair, this game was able to create an experience that feels like you've been transported back to the golden age of JRPGs. It's a game that steps up and delivers something with properties and perhaps more importantly quality, the likes of which we haven't seen in a long time. And that's why you could say Chained Echoes is the greatest indie game. But there are a few others I want to consider as well. Let's start by going to space. I have never played a game like Outerwilds, and I probably never will again. It received DLC and I'm afraid to play it because I know that once I do, I'll never be able to relive that experience. It's just that good. But it's not just the quality, it's unique in a way that no other game has been for me. It's a game about true, authentic exploration. It's not about following a predetermined questline or a story that guides you along each step of the way. It's about a guy from a space program who has his whole solar system to explore to his heart's content, just like the adventurers before him did. And just like any adventure, the fuel that propels this one forwards is curiosity and that sense of discovery after each milestone. There are moments in this game where you ask yourself a question: what exactly is that thing in the sky? Then you gradually take the steps to answer it. You enter your ship and lift off the planet in this brilliantly visceral sequence, and as that rock you once called home grows smaller into nothing more than another glowing dot among thousands, you begin to realize that you've already set out on an adventure that you'll likely never forget. Just this one sequence is so memorable that the moment I experienced it for the first time, I felt like I was finally playing something new, something with meaning and purpose. Despite that, it's nearly impossible to recommend, and you probably already know why. See, you might have noticed that I talked a lot about the gameplay of Chained Echoes, but I've barely said anything about the actual game of Outerwilds, and there's a reason for that. The more I say, the worse this game will get, so I'll just leave it at this. The reason I recommend Outerwilds to so many people, despite the fact that I know it won't be for everyone, is because if it is for you, I'd have done you a terrible disservice in not at least letting you know about it. And you'd be doing yourself a terrible disservice in not giving this one-of-a-kind game a chance. And it's because of this one-of-a-kind nature and its ability to feel like more than just a game that I think Outerwilds is the best indie game of all time. Is what I would say if this video was over, but we've got one more game to look at. With each new release, Supergiant continues to assert themselves as one of the greatest game developers in the field. What started with Bastion over a decade ago has culminated in one of the biggest reveals on one of the biggest stages in gaming, but it's the prequel to that reveal that stands above the rest for me. Going into Hades, I was nervous. Supergiant hadn't made a bad game before this, but I really wasn't a fan of roguelites. It was a weird mix, but I was willing to give it a shot out of trust for Supergiant games. Now, in hindsight, I know that was the right choice, as Hades quickly shot up to one of my favorite games of all time. But it was only able to do this because of the experts that designed it. As I mentioned before, Supergiant isn't exactly a new studio. They've been at this for over a decade, and when you play their games, that becomes pretty apparent. But let's talk about Hades. This may be the closest to perfect a game has ever gotten for me. Celeste is pretty close too, but Hades versus Celeste is not a topic I can cover in a reasonable amount of time, nor is it one that I particularly want to, so just play both games. Anyway, every aspect of Hades is polished to such an absurd degree that even if you don't like roguelites, you might enjoy this game. You see, even though it has expertly crafted gameplay, I genuinely struggle to confidently select just one aspect of this game as the best. Maybe it's the music that creates intense moments of pure adrenaline-filled action only to masterfully slow everything down to a crawl at just the right moment. Or it could be the near endlessly customizable combat with 6 weapons, each with 4 different forms and dozens of abilities from the gods. Or maybe it's the stories that this game is able to tell, or it's the brilliant synergy between the player and the main character Zagreus, or the colorful personalities of the characters. There's just so much this game does right, and as a result, it's a shining example of why some indies can go toe-to-toe with some of the best AAA games in the scene. Hades is a vibrant light that shows us not just how good an indie game can be, but that every single day, new people with dreams of game development are starting their own journey that may one day put them on the same stage as the greats. Indies are special because of their ability to revive series long since gone. They're special because of the brilliant ideas that they bring to the table, and perhaps most importantly, indies show us that the future for gaming is in good hands, so long as people who love this medium keep creating. With all that said, let's answer the question from the beginning. I don't like endings. In fact, I'm making a whole video on that topic. They leave me feeling empty and sad, and I'd imagine I'm not the only one who feels like that. But when I finished one of the games on this list, I felt the opposite. I felt content and genuinely excited to move on. Not because I didn't like it, but because the ending was so meaningful and impactful that I couldn't help but just sit back in my chair and smile, knowing I had just completed one of the most special journeys I'd ever experienced. And I can't say much else, because the more I say, the worse this game gets. Now, like I said at the start, this isn't about which game is my favorite. That's a topic for another video. But there is no indie game that was more impactful to me than Outerwilds. And that's why I can pretty confidently say that I think Outerwilds is the best indie game of all time. By the way, if you're interested in Chained Echoes, here's the video on it that I mentioned earlier.